Hi, and welcome back to the Mob Mentality Show. I'm Chris Lucian, and my co-host is Austin Chadwick. And today we're going to be talking about mobbing in the midst of waterfalls. I think this is probably some stories that might trigger other stories, and so this might be a story episode a little bit. But Austin, what did you have in mind?
Yeah. So this came from some fairly recent experiences while programming full time, and I think leading up to these experiences, I had experienced quite a bit of mobbing in an environment that was very, just the domain and everyone you interacted with was pretty leaned out. I think, or pretty darn agile from the values and principles perspective. And so things just kind of flowed, just kind of with mobbing quite nicely for the most part. But then I switched to a team that I'd been on before, and for whatever, for better or for worse, we found ourselves with the highest priority work being kind of a mob in the midst of waterfalls. So it's like everyone we were working with was kind of in a waterfall mode, and it just led to interesting scenarios. And at the time, we were experimenting with AI a lot, and who knows, it may make it into the thumbnail for this episode when we release it. But AI did generate this image of three Lord of the Rings type people, drinking tea in a boat, just completely surrounded by waterfalls. And it felt quite a lot like our experience. We were having a good time, but we could definitely feel the effects of waterfalls coming at us from every angle. And so I suspect people who are out there experimenting with mobbing may find themselves in this scenario. So here you go.
So good. I mean, yeah, what were some of those impacts, I guess, or what was the like, where was the main conflict? Was it a conflict? Was it maybe
Yeah.
something that you had to resolve? How was that? How did that happen?
Yeah. I mean, I felt like there were two different projects, especially think from the other team's perspective, it was seen as a waterfall project. And so there were two particular waterfall projects that we interacted with that come to mind the most for me. So the first one was essentially like a company-wide initiative related to data. And it may have been version 2 or 3 of a similar initiative that you've been a part of, Chris.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
um, and I'm sure I've been through these kind of initiatives before at companies, and basically, when at least when we started working on it, or at least when I joined the team and they were working on it, it kind of had the feeling of a lot of waterfall projects where there were like 30 things in progress, and each thing was like 5% done, and then each thing the next week was 6% done, and it was kind of inching along in that direction, and so when we started working on it, we were like, well, how can we work on this so one thing gets all the way done, right? And so what was kind of cool is that before I started this work with this mob, there was already kind of a weekly mobbing session set up with the other technical team members. And so we just kind of leaned on that and just kind of shifted the agenda to be, hey, instead of working on, these 30 apps at once, let's work on one app and do this, you know what I mean? And so that was kind of shift one, was kind of negotiating with the waterfall that, hey, at least for our mob, instead of having 30 things in progress, we're going to have one. How does that work? Will that work out fine? And I think eventually the negotiations were fine. I think in that case, they were quite fine with it. It didn't really seem to matter to them. So there wasn't really much pushback from that. But the cool thing is that, uh, you know, the people, part of our mob, and then the people we interact with on occasion kind of centralized around that idea. And we all started working towards that initiative. And so we got one app all the way to production with everything working. And then we learned from that one app being in production from the experiences there, and that led into how we worked on the next ones. And so, yeah, that's kind of one experience of it. And I think part of it is finding a way to have as much lean flow efficiency as you can internally as a mob, and then being empathetic for others who are pulled in other directions. Like I remember back when I was in Waterfall, at one point, I was getting status requests from 6 different projects, right? And I think at one point I just went to my manager, and I didn't know much about Agile stuff, and I'm just like, this maybe doesn't feel right. I'm working on 7 different projects. Maybe I should be working on maybe only 3 or 4, right?
Yeah.
Or something like that.
Smaller, limited whip.
Yeah, exactly. Um,
The pit
and
of the stomach
so
feeling.
yeah, so while we internally in the mob could work in that fashion, we had dependencies on other people who were kind of in that mode of
Yeah.
working on 5 or 6 or 7 different things. And yeah, I'm sure you've had experiences like that. How did you navigate that, Chris?
Yeah, well, it's funny because I feel like it comes up over and over again. And this might go back to comments I've made in the past on the show about growing the bubble of, agility and other things outward, mobbing. So I had been part of a similar data migration years earlier, actually for the same system. And in that, we realized a lot of the thing, a lot of people were saying, oh, this piece is done when the definition of done was like a proof of concept was made, and the next stage is going to be like a long testing phase afterwards. And so, I kind of our goal sort of became, make that long testing phase as unlikely to fail the first time as possible. And so that's, in that way we compressed the feedback loop. And the way we did that initially was, using approval tests to then verify data before and after part of the migration process. And so, we would say, yes, the proof of concept is done, but our automated tests are failing in whatever way. Um, and and what was really cool was just the feedback loop. Like people were interested and engaged when a bug was found, and so even on the waterfall side of the house, it was very much there was a lot of engagement still. And so this is what I've experienced is that if you often if you're dealing with a team that has, especially that has their testing phase at the end of their process, um, if you start automating integration tests, even for work that other teams are doing, then you'll find regressions very quickly. And then there's a lot of engagement around those regressions, and then it removes risk, and then people actually become very thankful because it would have been much worse had you gotten to the end of the project and then discovered those things. So so in that, I think we developed like this gratitude and like a reciprocation of interactions. And I think people tend to naturally go farther toward limited WIP, especially if there are automated regression tests running, because between groups, right? And so uh and one behavior I've observed when encountering this before with kind of like different philosophies, right? So I run into people where it's like, oh, well, it's their group's problem. They're going to have to write their own tests. And if they want to do manual testing, that's fine. Let them do it. And I think that's the wrong way to look at it, because often some people are so deep into the work that they don't have the capacity or the throughput to add those tests. And so it may be something where you just lean into the relationship more in order to get that single item WIP available. And so that was kind of my experience in that scenario. And in fact, it's like, so I had kind of a couple goals. Like one is never be the bottleneck, right? So if you're the bottleneck, then figure out ways out of being the bottleneck. And then once you're not the bottleneck, is support others in them not, wherever the bottleneck is help support them and not being the bottleneck. And often that's, I think, related to rework. And so, whoever is experiencing the most rework in a project will likely become the bottleneck in that project. And so what I've observed is often interdisciplinary like integration tests can really expose things a lot faster and remove the risks from a project, even if it's waterfall.
Yeah, and that's a piece I forgot to. Yeah, that the automation part of it was huge for us as well, because um, the because when we first started working on it, it was like, oh, okay, we start mobbing together, with these other team members, or we hear what they're working on, and it was a lot of clicking around and looking at data manually, right? Clicking around and looking at data manually, and then you kind of get a feel for like, okay, what are they checking for? What are we doing? How do we know it works? How do we know it doesn't? Can we write fast tests for this, or are we stuck with slow tests? And what are ways we can inspect both parts of the system? The kind of waterfall projects and the code or things they work on versus the code we're working on. And you're right, the automation and the test automation in our pipeline kind of became uh, I'm thinking of the wrong analogy here, but like the blood flow, that like the way the project operated was like each day, or after each change, people in the waterfall parts of the project were asking, well, how's the pipeline running, or what are the issues, or any issues found, did it pass or fail? And because just like it was almost kind of like the mob became the automationist for, it was like the facilitator to automation for the rest of the parts of the waterfall parts of the project. In that the more we learned, the more we just added more and more into the automation.
Yeah.
And the more that was added to it, the more that other teams became reliant on it for how well the project is going. And in fact, early on when we were adding the automation, there was a day or two where the automation went down, and then another part of the system made a change, and then it led to a production bug, basically. But kind of the lesson learned from us internally and the rest of the project was like, never let the automation be off. Like, because it finds the issues immediately, right? And you can fix them before they get to production. And
And it encourages collaboration, right? Like the key,
yes.
I think the key element there is that
Yeah.
it's like, hey, it's valuable and we're here to talk about it. But if you said, hey, we're automating tests around the stuff you do, like people could become defensive, right? But but when it's like, oh, we noticed this, here you go. And so maybe you don't come out and say it's all automated, but by the fifth or sixth time you've discovered a bug in the last like couple days, people are gonna be like, what's going on? Like, why are they so good at finding these? And so you can kind of incrementally grow that engagement and say like, hey, this is really cool. We're just seeing all the work that you're doing, and we're so I know that a lot of developers feel resentful about having to write tests for other people. Um, and but I encourage everyone who is feeling that way to get over that and instead think of it as making everybody successful together. And sometimes this is like organizational metrics when I hear about stuff like this is like, maybe everybody's optimizing for their own thing, right? So this is especially bad when testing teams are incentivized by the number of bugs that they find, right? So it's like, oh, you didn't find any bugs, so your team obviously did horribly. So that's really dangerous because you're basically incentivizing the system to be separate, right? You are, and there's like a very much a cross-validation approach, but if you could get to the point where the incentivization is zero production bugs between the groups, then I think they gradually become more and more collaborative. And so I think we were fortunate enough to be in an organization where that sort of separation and those incentives were not separate. But just for anyone out there that's experiencing something similar, you want to watch out for this where the incentive structure is in the opposite directions. And especially if there's like you're trying to squash bugs and other people are trying to find them before you do. But if you automate a lot of these checks ahead of time, then you can also use those metrics to your advantage because you can expose your project being different than others in the sense that a team finding bugs in other projects more frequently does not find them as often in yours or something along those lines. So you just got to be careful about that.
Yeah, for sure. And I agree. It's a lot how you do that automation, right? I think for us, it was natural. It's kind of like, okay, you're asking us to migrate from A to B. To do that, we're going to be writing some test automation, and we just have some pre-flight checks and post-flight checks of the systems around us before we, and then those pre-flight and post-flight checks kind of grew, and they wanted it to grow as the time went, as they saw how it worked, and so it was quite natural and quite good. Yeah, and I guess before we close out the topic, I think I'll mention one other thing. It was a different project, but kind of a surrounded by waterfalls thing, quite scenario to shift gears is just being vigilant and fighting for lean, because when you are surrounded by waterfalls, the flow of the waterfall, you might quite literally have to be, is it the salmon that have like to swim up the waterfall, or
Yeah.
whatever, right? Like to go against the tide. There will be times where, because you are a mob in the midst of the waterfalls, and that the whole system isn't lean optimized, the organization will be, their priorities will be misaligned, right? So it might be given that, for good business reasons. In fact, the business reasons were fantastic. Like the return on investment was humongous. That our top priority is A, let's say. But our top priority A requires interdependence on another infrastructure or team or component that for historical reasons is managed outside of your group, right? And so, but for whatever reason, that group may not have the same priorities.
Yeah.
And so you might be like, hey, we need a thing, and just give us this one thing. And then we can just like, we can make the full solution to solve the, customer problem, have the big return on investment. And the response might be, yeah, that sounds great. We booked a meeting 6 months out to talk to you about it. And you're like, what?
Yeah.
And
No.
yeah. And so it's kind of like,
What if I ask nicely?
yeah. And so, there's no blame in there. I mean, they have, for good reason, the people working in those organizations have the priorities they do and things like that. It's just, there's just a misalignment at the system level of what's most important, right? And so, there was a strong temptation to let it go, and I think there are times to let it go work on something else because the rest of the company's not ready. But I think there are times where it works out quite nicely to be vigilant. And if this, because I think our mob was really sold on the return on investment of the business proposition and providing the solution, and like how beneficial it would be. And so we're like, well, what are other ways we can get this done? Um, and through, long story short, through a long series of interactions and half building it ourselves and half not, eventually, we were given just enough to get it done without waiting for the meeting 6 months later, you know what I mean? And start providing value now instead of later. And so I think there is a time and place to be vigilant if you're surrounded by waterfalls, and keep thinking of third alternatives. And I know
Yeah.
Chris was shepherding us through this as this was happening. I remember quite vividly. And so, yeah.
Yeah. Well, so it just happened that we had kind of gone through a similar thing, but yeah, you're right. The lean aspects of this are crucially important, and you know, those big migrations, there's such a big risk around them, and a lot of the times, it's just that traditional style, and a lot more people are invited to large scale data migrations as well. But even in other aspects, I also find that when people depend on the production of things, always looking out for similarities between events, because so when you talk about the shepherding, it was like, hey, this is a lot like that thing before. And the amounts of automation that you can do, and so for that repetition, so you can, I anticipate that we'll run into one of these again in the future, and so it's how do we continue that thread. But it's funny when you get to the time scale of decades in a organization, you start seeing these like 5-10 year recurrences start happening, and then whole teams have to adjust to and possibly deal with them differently. So there might be something in there about considering the organizational memory.
Absolutely. And one last thing, and then I think we'll close on this episode, but is one thing that was quite helpful in all of that is it's in the values and principles of several things. I've most recently seen it in DevOps practitioners, but it's basically having a very clear understanding of the business problem, because I think even business people will be like, here's a problem, and the solution is this stack of A, B, C, D XYZ combinations of internally existing company technologies, right?
Mhm.
And for them, that is the one and only way to solve the business problem, right? And so I think what helped us swim up the waterfall, um, and it wasn't necessarily always pretty, and there was definitely some conflict, but was that it helped us get crystal clear on what the business problem was, in that, okay, you do need A and B, but you don't need C, and you can still solve the business problem. Or you don't need any of it, and you can solve it in a completely, different way than anyone has thought of before. And so, and also being crystal clear on the priorities, because sometimes with waterfall thinking, trying to think of a not negative way to say it, but there might be, in a waterfall project, let's say there's 10 things in it, because scope is usually pretty big in a waterfall project, and items 1 and 2 might have humongous return on investments, right? But it's grouped together with items 3 through 10 as well, right? And so in people working on those waterfall projects, they're all together as one thing, and you don't separate them, right? And it can be confusing and frustrating when people start separating out the different parts of it. And so to get crystal clear on which priorities, which ones have the big return on investment, and working on those first, and thinking of technical solutions that solve maybe the first thing in the 10 things, but maybe does nothing for items 3 through 10. And that's okay, because it's the first iteration, right? And so I think iterating on that again and again with everyone you're interacting with can be challenging, but quite beneficial for having a good cycle time on giving value to people. So yeah.
Right.
Cool.
Well,
Well, I guess we'll shut this one down, but please like and subscribe if you've been a mob or even an agile team or a pair in the midst of waterfalls. We'd love to hear experiences. Please, interact with the YouTube comments or LinkedIn, Twitter, and more. Or we're happy to see it. And like and subscribe and mob on, and have a good one until next time. See ya.
Hi, everybody.